Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lorenzo and Giuliano. Andiamo avanti. How do we begin, Renaissance people, to unpack the very much underappreciated Lucrezia Tornabuoni? She is so often presented as the so-called Mother of the Magnificent, in that her greatness comes from her proximity to him, rather than the reality that much of his success comes from his proximity to her. And maybe you're thinking, but Lawrence, isn't that what you're doing now by covering Lucrezia as part of the overarching story of Lorenzo? And maybe you'd be right, although I do hope that in the next half hour, I will be able to decenter Lorenzo and reposition part of his achievement in light of Lucrezia, and to do justice to a truly essential and superb figure of the Italian Renaissance, politician, diplomat, poet, author, we can even say one of the humanists, Lucrezia Tornabuoni de' Medici. Where are we in our Medici timeline? Lucrezia was born into the noble Tornabuoni family in 1427 in Florence. The Tornabuoni, who settled in Florence as the Tornaquinci in the 10th century, earned significant status within the feudal system of the Middle Ages, not the republican system of the Renaissance. So a slight change in name from Tornaquinci to Tornabuoni did not really remove their elite status by the Quattrocento, and Lucrezia was born on the eve of the exile of Cosimo de' Medici, her future father-in-law. Now, I discussed this exile in more detail in previous episodes, namely in Cosimo's return to Florence and his consolidation of power through art patronage. Yet, there's another element to the return from his exile. Just as Cosimo had wed, that's Contessina dei Bardi, of the respected Bardi family of Florence, so too did he want to continue to build powerful alliances with Florentines through marriage. So bookmark this from Contessina dei Bardi to Cosimo, Lucrezia Tornabuoni to Piero. So 1443, at about 16 years of age, Lucrezia Tornabuoni was wed to Cosimo's son, Piero de' Medici, right? That's going to be Piero the Gouty. And Lucrezia and Piero are the mother and father of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Giuliano de' Medici, and their daughters Bianca and Nannina. So the Tornabuoni house is joined with the Medici house, combining old nobility with very wealthy bankers. So we're two houses united, but not simply a mere political alliance, but rather two intellectuals, Lucrezia and Piero, born and bred in the humanist culture that was cultivated the generation before by Cosimo and his allies, which included the Tornabuoni. It is under this intellectual atmosphere that helped shape Lorenzo de' Medici into Lorenzo the Magnificent. We're talking about a mother with an education in Latin, although maybe not to the extent of the tutors she hires, like Poliziano, who are masters of classical Latin. But she also provides an education that was deeply pious and was able to balance the contradictory notions of the pagan revival of the humanists with the dominant Christian culture of Renaissance Florence. At the same time, Lucrezia's husband Piero was constantly ill, and while the would-be princes were still young, she was the leading diplomat of the Medici family and worked carefully to bring up her sons into that role, as we know, perhaps too early. So indeed, she was central in all of the business functions of the Medici Bank, but also in other operations such as running a thermal bathhouse, local charities in Florence through convents and confraternities, and ultimately forging strong bonds between the Florentine public and the family by investing in building up the social structures of the city. Charity produced public support for the Medici, led by Lucrezia. And although we often speak of her as being behind the scenes, her reputation as admired and as a known intellectual says otherwise. There is, in fact, a quote that floats around about her, but as far as I know, there's no primary source to confirm this quote. It's sort of a rumor, I suppose, but at the very least, it gives us an idea about the history and how Lucrezia is discussed. Apparently, sometime before Cosimo died in 1464, he had referred to Lucrezia already as, quote, the man of the family, unquote. Uncomfortable misogyny aside, and I can't say if that's true or not, it seems that Lucrezia had a predominant role in the running of the Medici family. But what is true is that Piero would die only 5 years after Cosimo, that's 1469, and Lucrezia would continue her work as the primary head of Medici affairs as she continued to guide young Lorenzo and Giuliano into becoming the highly skilled statesman that, well, Giuliano will get killed and Lorenzo will become this highly skilled statesman. So part of that meant collaborating with her bedridden husband before his death to change the Medici playbook. What do I mean by that? If Lorenzo was to continue the family line, which was now part Medici mixed with noble Tornabuoni blood, even though nobility was this sort of shaky term, like historic nobility, then Lorenzo would need a wife. But this time, it would not be like his grandfather Cosimo marrying a Bardi of Florence. It would not be like his father Piero marrying a Tornabuoni of Florence. No, they were ready to expand their range of influence and their allegiances to the papal curia in Rome. And so they're looking for a member of the Orsini family, that is, Roman aristocracy. The proposed bride was Clarice Orsini, and Lucrezia went to Rome herself on a diplomatic mission to inspect this bride, and she wrote a detailed, if not somewhat brutal and kind of rude, report to Lorenzo about the looks and disposition of Clarice. And I'm going to read part of that letter to you now because it really tells us a lot about not only the crudeness of this process of bridal inspection, but also some intriguing differences between the Florentines and the Romans. I'm taking the translation into English of this letter from Judith Hook's biography of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lucrezia says in this letter that Clarice is, quote, is reasonably tall and fair-skinned. She is gentle in manner, without the ease we are used to, but she is biddable and will soon conform to our ways. Her hair is not blonde. They're not blonde here, but it is reddish and plentiful. Her face is on the round side, but I find it pleasant. Her neck is slender, almost perhaps on the thin side, but graceful. We didn't see her breasts. The women cover them here, but they gave the impression of being well formed. End quote. I must admit, especially with Florentine sumptuary laws, that is, you cannot publicly show your wealth in your attire, I find the remarks about the excessive covering quite interesting. We could not see her breasts. They cover them here. It gives you this idea that maybe there was a more um, uh, liberal dress code for women in Florence. We know that they were heavily policed. We know what they wore were heavily policed. That went for men as well, but in different ways, much different ways. So I find it really interesting that, especially when we talk about like the experience of Renaissance women in this very general term, but already Lucrezia, when she goes to Rome to inspect Clarice, to propose her for marriage to Lorenzo, notes these radical differences in how she holds herself and how she dresses. And it becomes this moment of remark for Lucrezia to say, we couldn't see her breasts, but I could tell under the clothes they're okay. Um, Ultimately, it's not a very flattering picture. These ideas are not, she's not overtly beautiful. She's pleasant. Her neck is long enough. She doesn't have blonde hair like she should, according to Lucrezia, because, of course, that was ideal for Florentines. If you guys think about the history of Simonetta Vespucci and the crafting of Venus and this idea of a blonde woman is an ideal woman. She's not blonde. She's pleasant. Her breasts are okay. She's an Orsini, so she'll have to do. That's the idea. And so importantly, we see Lucrezia playing a pivotal role in the direct political and diplomatic affairs of not only the Medici family, but of Florence itself. In all of this, one of the most essential and pivotal aspects of her personality comes directly from her piety, which serves as an anchor for her cultural production.
So, on one hand, Lucrezia appears to have very close ties to the Neoplatonists and the humanists. She was the direct patron of the Morgante by Luigi Pulci, an extremely long epic that was finished in 1483 and is tied to the popular French chivalric epics in the court of Charlemagne. And it was lyric in nature and became popular very quickly in Florence, something equivalent to pop culture today. Pulci was a complex figure, one who had some scorn for religious beliefs, and appears to somewhat have been a secular figure, even if he tried to recover his social credibility with a later apology. Still, Morgante remains a lengthy but important text in the history of Quattrocento literary works, and this is also due directly to Lucrezia Tornabuoni's commissioning of that work. So she's making and forging political alliances on one hand, she's commissioning large works of literature on the other, and in addition to all of this, most importantly, Lucrezia was an active poet herself, and one who earned the praise and recognition of her male peers, especially Poliziano. Composed at various unidentified periods of her adult life, Lucrezia composed a series of religious works, mostly religious works, that demonstrate a very close relationship to the trends of Florentine Renaissance poetry. For example, she wrote what are called laudi, which are essentially prayer songs, written to be sung, sometimes in public, sometimes in festivals, sometimes in a religious context. One of them, titled Ecco el Messia, that is, the Song of the Nativity or Here is the Messiah, she specifically writes that this laudo should be sung the melody of Poliziano's Ben Venga Maggio, a ballad loosely translated to Welcome to May, the month of May, which is a ballad that was sung during the beginning of spring in praise of love and rebirth in the typical Polician fashion, right? So Lucrezia writes a prayer song to the Nativity that coincides with this secular tune written by her fellow poet and member of the Medici circle. It's really interesting because she specifically notes that this Ecco el Messia should be sung to the exact melody of Ben Venga Maggio. So she wants you to be able to access a predetermined melody that people would have known and sung and just apply her lyrics to it, which is quite interesting. And beyond the Laudi, Lucrezia also wrote much longer verses, retelling biblical stories, and these are known as storie sacre, sacred stories, sacred histories, something to that effect. Her most famous of these storie sacre are that of Saint John the Baptist, who is not only the patron saint of Florence, but he's also the patron saint of the Tornabuoni family. Remember, Florentine families had patron saints. For the Medici, it was Saint Cosmas and Damian, and it was Saint Lawrence or San Lorenzo, which is why, Lorenzo is a recurring name in the Medici family, and so is Cosimo. So Saint John the Baptist was the patron saint of the Tornabuoni family, and Lucrezia especially wrote verse versions of these storie sacre of biblical heroines, the ladies like Esther and Judith. I think the case of Judith is particularly exciting because the history aligns with similar notions of Florentine identity, especially with certain biblical themes. So Judith, in the Florentine context, is like David, right? King David, the giant slayer, slays Goliath, popularly represented first by Donatello and Verrocchio, which was adopted as a Medici symbol, and then Michelangelo, who's going to reappropriate David for the Florentine Republic. So there's no short history of David, yet Judith too fulfills the same role, where the devout Christian woman leaves her city, which is besieged by Holofernes, a general of the conquering king Nebuchadnezzar, and liberates her home from his invasion by the divine grace of the Hebrew God. So both David slaying Goliath and Judith slaying Holofernes become symbols of the Florentine Republic overcoming the tyrannical forces that continually oppress them. That's the idea of the symbolism. And those symbols of Judith and David are adopted by the Medici to center them as the expellers of the tyrants. And just as he likely did his bronze David for Cosimo de' Medici, Donatello also sculpted a marvelous Judith beheading Holofernes for Cosimo for the Medici palace, the very palace where Lucrezia lived with Piero, Lorenzo, and the rest of the Medici clan. So at once, her choice of Judith as a female poet, treating the female heroine, places her within a dominant narrative of Medici cultural output, where certain religious symbols are used and appropriated for family needs. Still, much like Artemisia Gentileschi's painting of the same subject, Judith beheading Holofernes, that's going to come over a century later, it gives us better insight into female perspectives. So too does Lucrezia's poetic work on the same subject.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
So what is this work? Lucrezia writes exclusively in the Vulgate, that is the vernacular language, the Florentine lingua parlata, the spoken word, the very type of writing that her son Lorenzo will take up and reestablish among the cultural elite. Remember, the dominant poetic form at this point in the Renaissance was classical Latin, revived from ancient Rome. It would appear that Lorenzo's repopularizing of the vernacular poetry stems actually from Lucrezia, not from his own spontaneous innovation. So these storie sacre were bound and published in an illuminated manuscript. That doesn't mean it turns on like a lamp. It means it is painted, right? Highly decorated. That's what an illuminated manuscript is. And this was done towards the end of her life or like soon after her death, which was in 1482. Okay, so we're talking about a bound volume, which is expensive to make, commissioned, printed. And not only was it made into a manuscript, but we also know that to some extent her works were popular because by 1518, 40 years later, verse 35 from this Judith Sacra Storia appears in a Florentine play about the story of Judith and Holofernes. So they're actually using her poetry in the production of theater. The primary characterization of Judith is one of a woman of devout piety. Here's the story. Her city is under siege. They're at the breaking point, and she is moved by God to go out to the enemy encampment and seduce Holofernes. She does not do this by being indecent, but rather by proclaiming that her starved city has turned his back on God, and for that, she has come to give Holofernes the key to conquering the city in retribution against those who have betrayed her deity. It's all made up, of course, because she's got a plan. For 3 days, she remains in his camp, brave, devout, praying daily, resolute, always faithful to God. And this is a way that Lucrezia is reflecting herself in Judith. Lucrezia writes that Judith has, this is a quote translated into English, a manly heart. And even more interesting, she chooses in her written language, in the original Vulgate, to have Judith address Holofernes in the tu form, meaning Judith sees Holofernes as an equal. while she remains the formal voi with Holofernes' guard, a sign of respect. Something very interesting here, if you do not know the Italian language, there are two ways to address people. One is formal. In modern Italian, you say lei, you don't say voi. But if you read Renaissance Italian, voi is the formal you. Tu, in both modern Italian and Renaissance Italian, remains the informal. So here we have this Judith, this devout, pious Judith, with a manly heart, about to slay Holofernes, to lure him in, and she addresses him as an equal. And then merry, festive, falling in love with Judith, Holofernes has a little bit too much to drink, and he passes out and he goes to bed. And I'm going to read for you two of Lucrezia's verses from this story, translated excellently by Jane Tylis in her book on this called Sacred Narratives. These are verses 125 and 126 from Lucrezia Tornabuoni's telling of the story of Judith. Holofernes is now passed out asleep in his bed, his head hanging lightly over the edge of the bed, and Lucrezia writes, "Once she had said her prayer, Judith rose, her heart resolved, and in one hand she grasped a sword she had found leaning against a column or the wall. And so well did the young woman brandish it, it would have been fitting for a strong and sturdy man. She struck him twice with force, and his head rolled away from his shoulders. And after this the valiant woman cut it clean, for there was little left to do. And she took it carefully in her hands, and she gave it to her handmaiden. And she said to her, 'Say nothing.' And from the curtain encircling the bed, she tore a piece of fabric and bundled into it only the head, which she intended to carry away." End quote. And here we have Judith being represented by Lucrezia, again, like a man. The way she wielded this sword and sliced through his head. Isn't that a beautiful image? And this is an image that you get. She would have seen it from Donatello. If you look at that sculpture by Donatello, it is very gruesome. Botticelli also did paintings of this. It was a popular theme. And then, of course, famously later, Caravaggio will do his and Artemisia will do hers. It is a very hideous and yet alluring imagery that these artists play on this heroine Judith brandishing a sword and cutting through the head of Holofernes, who's fallen asleep, drunkenly smitten with her. Ultimately, Lucrezia's poetry is greatly overlooked, so as is her contribution to the thriving culture that is cultivated under the Medici when Lorenzo rises to power. Not only is his own work influenced by his mother, but his relaxed and somewhat disinterested relationship with the Medici Bank is only allowed because Lucrezia is there to continue to manage the banking affairs, which Lorenzo admits in a letter after her death at the age of 54 in 1482. We do have images of her, at least arguably images of her, including a 1475 portrait by Domenico Ghirlandaio, which looks almost exactly like the same person that Ghirlandaio paints in his famous Tornabuoni Chapel in Santa Maria Novella in Florence. This chapel was commissioned by Giovanni Tornabuoni, that would be Lucrezia's brother, between 1485 and 1490, making her appearance in this cycle a portrait after her death, because she dies in 1482. This doesn't begin until 1485. The chapel itself is dedicated to the Virgin Mary and guess who? St. John the Baptist, again, a Tornabuoni saint and a patron saint of Florence, acting in a similar way as Lucrezia's poetry did in relating family power to sacred narrative. It is in that very same chapel that we see famous portraits of the humanists as well, Cristoforo Landino, Marsilio Ficino, along with none other than Poliziano, who appears to have really been a close friend and fellow poet to Lucrezia Tornabuoni. So let me end by saying that Lucrezia Tornabuoni is not a marginal figure in the Laurentian court, but an absolute central one, and even, we can say, a nucleus Although she was most prominent as a stateswoman, it is also clear that she had no small impact on the literary and cultural output of Renaissance Florence, but was rather dynamic as a writer, as a patron, and as a cultural cultivator. In the end, when we look at her broader history, as expanding the financial input of the Medici family, as opening up businesses and running the thermal baths and doing diplomatic missions around the peninsula, and raising Lorenzo, and cultivating poetry, and negotiating the place of a noble woman in high elite culture, I will maintain that Lucrezia Tornabuoni had no small part to play in the eventual success of Lorenzo the Magnificent. As always, I extend to you all my thanks for tuning in. Your support means everything to me, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation about Lucrezia Tornabuoni de' Medici. Until next time, arrivederci.